Some consoles and games age well and end up becoming classics. They're classics because we can always go back to them, having stood the test of time. But there's some consoles that haven't aged well, either due to featuring really outdated tech, being replaced by something that plays the same games, but offers advantages over the original system, or they haven't aged well physically, with component failures or lack of replacement parts hindering the average collector from easily obtaining or maintaining an older system. And that's what we'll be looking at today. Obviously, this is all going to be my opinion, and everything I'll talk about here is with consoles I have personal experience with. With that in mind, let's get started. Nintendo Game Boy, Game Boy Pocket, and Game Boy Color. As great and popular as those systems were back in the day, most collectors prefer to play these games on a GBA or Game Boy player. None of these models feature any front or backlighting, and while regular Game Boy games are in color when played on a Game Boy Color, you might as well just go with a GBA since it plays everything. There's the Game Boy Light too, of course, but despite having a lit screen, it's still monochrome. The early GBAs don't have lit screens, but can be modded to have backlighting, which is nice for those people who don't like the SP's form factor, or don't want to use a silly adapter just to use headphones. The only advantage an original Game Boy has is sound, and there's a link in the description with some in-depth analysis about that topic. I'm really into audio, so personally I wouldn't mind eventually picking up an OG GB just to hear it for myself. Sega Game Gear. This is an interesting handheld console which topped the Game Boy in terms of features. The lit colored screen is certainly nicer than the Game Boy, and it's what the best character in the Neptunia series is based on as well, so that's always awesome. The problem is that over time the screen becomes washed out due to capacitors getting old, but a dirty contrast wheel potentiometer is also something that can cause that problem. Dark lines across the screen is another issue that some systems have. All of these problems are just due to age and can be fixed, but it's still kind of daunting for someone who's never used a soldering iron before. Sony PSP. The PlayStation Portable is a great handheld console. There are 5 variations in hardware, as far as I know, but there isn't a clear consensus on which one's the best because they all have some trade-offs that offset their advantages. For example, the PSP 3000 has much less ghosting and more vivid colors, but at the same time it suffers from interlacing and the build quality is definitely not as nice as the PSP 1000. And the PSP Go has a totally different form factor, which I think is pretty cool, and many people find it preferable to the traditional PSP shape. This is the first generation of handheld consoles that didn't run on disposable batteries, but rather rechargeable lithium-ion batteries. And today most original batteries are either done or are on their way out. And the problem for retro gamers now is the lack of proper aftermarket batteries. A lot of them only last for a short time or are dead on arrival. Some people have done mods to use other kind of batteries, but it's not something everyone wants or is able to do. This is something I'm going to have to look into myself, because this one's done and this one's starting to go bad. 5th generation consoles. This might be a bit controversial to say, but I don't think most 5th gen consoles aged very well at all, and this is mainly due to the transition to 3D graphics in my opinion. 3D graphics were still a new thing at the time and often looked very wonky. Let's talk about the PS1 first. I remember when it came out when I was still a kid and going to the electronics section in my local Marktkauf and seeing the graphics for the first time, and I thought it looked ugly. I was playing games on a computer at the time, so I was already used to 3D graphics for a few years by that time, and compared to what I was used to, the PS1 was terrible. Everything was extremely blocky, and there were so many graphical glitches and things flickering. I find it a bit difficult to go back to these games today, but that doesn't mean I don't like the system or its games. The PS1 has a lot of exclusives, and it's also the only system that has Driver 2, so I'm willing to put up with the lack of graphics, because the gameplay is great. And also the PS1 controller eventually morphed into what we now know as the modern controller, which is pretty significant. My feelings about the N64 are somewhat similar, but with the added spectacle that can only be described as the Nintendo 64 controller. The graphics were somehow the opposite kind of bad compared to the PS1. Instead of harsh and jagged, it's all blurry and soft. My eyes hurt after a while because everything looks out of focus. Frame rates were pretty crappy as well, and the terrible analog stick doesn't help in the gameplay department. Even a brand new N64 controller doesn't feel good to my hands. If possible, I prefer to either play remakes of N64 games or use an emulator so I can make these terrible graphics go away. I know I sound harsh, but that's just how I feel about it. I do want to talk about the PS1 and N64 in more detail in the future, because it's an interesting time with many interesting games. Of course, there are other 5th gen consoles. The Atari Jaguar has hardware issues on top of being a dental tool. The Panasonic 3DO isn't the most reliable thing either, but it has some really good ports of certain games, like Road Rash and Street Fighter 2, apparently. For those consoles, I would look up the AVGN reviews, since I don't have any experience with them personally. The Sega Saturn I don't know anything about, sadly. What's interesting is that these more obscure consoles are in a way more interesting now because of the fact that they failed to capture the imagination of the market back in the day. So I wouldn't really say that any of those aged badly in a cultural standpoint, I guess. Microsoft Xbox. I don't like to use the word hate, but I feel it's appropriate when it comes to describing Microsoft's lack of ability to name things properly. To me, this is always going to be the Xbox One because that's what people called it when the Xbox 2 came out. Is the next system going to be called Xbox 64? Anyway, now that I'm done being negative about something as insignificant as the name of a VCR, I'll say that I really like the Xbox. I have some really good memories of it. It has unique exclusives, graphics were usually the best of the consoles of the time, innovative online features, and featured a hard drive. And the hard drive is one of the reasons the system hasn't aged well. Hard drives stop working over time and many people just chuck the system once it stops working. My local landfill has a bin to throw old electronics in, and over the last decade, there's almost always an Xbox in the bin when I've been there. Makes you wonder how many have been thrown away over the years. The problem is that the motherboard and hard drive are married, so if the hard drive dies, the motherboard just won't accept any replacement hard drive unless you mod the console, which most people simply won't do. I wish I could have rescued some of the thrown away Xboxes, but the landfill makes money on recycling electronics, so they monitor the bins to make sure that no one takes anything. It's kind of a shame. One day I want to talk more about this console, because there are some interesting things about it. It's Microsoft's first console after all, and introduced many now popular franchises. Early Xbox 360s. Since we're on the topic of Xboxes, we might as well bring up the 360. And it's for the reason you're probably expecting. Red Ring of Death and all that good stuff. That was such a fiasco back in the day. In my high school, most people had a Wii and or a 360. A lot of my friends were red ringing left and right, and to this date, it's the most severe hardware issue I've ever had the misfortune of witnessing. This topic has been discussed and over-discussed, so let's not keep beating on a red-ringed Xbox. The best thing to do these days is to get an Xbox 360S. They're really quiet and much more reliable. The E model is an alternative, but it doesn't have an optical output. You might not need it, but you never know if your setup changes and you do need it for some reason in the future. Early PlayStation 3s. The yellow light of death was a thing that some people have had an issue with, but I don't think it was ever as frequent as the red ring of death. The yellow light is a bit like a check engine light on a car. It doesn't really tell you what's wrong. The main cause of the yellow light seemed to be overheating, which caused solder joints to not connect things that should be connected, which is why some people decided to reflow the solder by throwing the thing into an oven, which I always thought was pretty funny. Obviously, the yellow light can happen with any PS3 console, not just the early ones, but this problem was much more common with the older fat PS3s that had the silly Spider-Man font on them and looked like the MetLife building. Honorable mentions. There are some consoles I considered including in this video, so I figure I'll mention them at the end here. Nintendo Wiis can have disk drives fail on occasion. The good thing is that there are so many cheap replacement consoles, or even better, you can just mod the broken console to load games off a hard drive. It's an easy project, especially for the beginning modder. Early Wiis also had a problem where they could get really hot when in standby mode. My white Wii has this problem, but I just turned standby mode off. Failing GameCube drives is also something I've heard about, but I have no idea how frequent this problem is. I've had many GameCubes, and none of them have ever had any issues, so maybe someone with more experience on the subject can let us know in the comments if this is indeed a common failure or not. Also, I'll throw in a prediction here at the end. I think that most 7th gen consoles and up are going to age pretty badly. Imagine someone buying a PS4 for the first time, say 15 years from now. Online services are probably not going to be active at that time anymore, so how can they get patches and DLC? I'm going to guess modding or emulation is going to solve a lot of those problems eventually, but if you go more than 20 years into the past and look at something like a Super Nintendo, that still works because it's simple. And taking it apart and fixing a few things here and there isn't too complicated either. Just something to think about. But that's going to be it for this video. Let me know about your own experiences with consoles that haven't exactly aged gracefully. This was never intended to be a complete list. I don't think that's possible because I don't have experience with everything, and these are just opinions which not everyone will agree with. Check out my second channel if you haven't. I upload VODs on there, plus there will be some other videos going up real soon that aren't exactly related to what's on this channel, but are still hopefully interesting for some of you. Also check out Patreon. I put a lot of time into my videos. These aren't vlogs or reaction videos, which I can just pump out every few days. There's scripts to write, research to do, voiceovers to record, and footage to get, not to mention all the editing. If you have any suggestions for Patreon rewards, let me know. I want to make sure that people who are generous enough actually get something cool in return. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video.